When my father remarried, I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder, distance, like watching a storm gather far away, knowing it's coming but unable to move. I was 17, old enough to understand loss, but not yet wise enough to process what comes after. Clara, my stepmother, arrived with carefully packed suitcases and eyes that looked like they had learned to hide. She was beautiful in the sort of way that made you cautious, refined, graceful, but remote. Like a painting you're not supposed to touch. After my mother's death, my father, Martin, buried himself in work. He wasn't cruel, just unavailable. Always between flights, meetings, or deadlines. Our conversations became mechanical. When Clara entered our home, she brought color to the walls and fresh flowers to the kitchen, but no warmth to the air. She tried, I'll admit that. Breakfasts were served on time, clothes were folded neatly, and there were occasional attempts at polite conversation. But beneath the civility, something vital was missing. It was like sharing a house with someone who knew all the rules but didn't believe in the game. Most evenings, she would sit alone on the porch or go for solitary walks through the neighborhood. Her presence, although quiet, was undeniable. Her perfume lingered in rooms long after she left, like a memory trying to stay alive. One evening, while I sat reading in the living room, Clara stepped toward the door and said softly, "I'm going out for a little walk. The air helps clear my mind." She didn't wait for a response. The door clicked shut behind her. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A woman adjusting to a new life, trying to find a sense of balance, ordinary. But then he appeared. I heard a man's voice through the slightly cracked window. Deep, confident, casually familiar. I looked out and saw them, Clara and a man I didn't recognize. He was older, perhaps late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and an easy demeanor. His stance was relaxed, his tone almost rehearsed. Later I learned his name was Ray, our neighbor from the house across the street. Recently divorced, lives alone. He hadn't made much of an impression before, but now, suddenly, he was everywhere. At first, it was small things. A friendly wave. A short chat by the mailbox. Then longer conversations. Then laughter. I hadn't heard Clara laugh like that before. Not with my father. Not with anyone in the house. It was the kind of laughter that comes from forgetting you have to hold back. And it bothered me. I wanted to believe it was harmless. Neighbors talk. Adults socialize. But something about the way she tilted her head, the way she listened so intently to him, it wasn't the behavior of someone simply being polite. One afternoon, I asked her casually, "Ray stops by often, doesn't he?" She looked surprised, almost like she'd forgotten I lived here too. "He's just being neighborly. He offered to help fix the garden fence." She smiled, but her eyes shifted away from mine. That's when I knew she was lying, not directly, but by omission. The visits continued. Ray seemed to appear every evening like clockwork. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with stories, always with that same relaxed charm. And Clara, she began to change. She started wearing her hair differently. She hummed while setting the table. She even brought home flowers, saying she bought them at a discount store, but they felt like gifts from someone else. It wasn't just the way she looked. It was the way she moved, softer, more deliberate, like a woman who had started seeing herself again in the mirror. One evening, I stood by the staircase and heard their voices more clearly. "Ray, Martin's always away. You're always alone. You deserve more than this." There was a pause. Clara didn't respond, not with words. But her silence spoke volumes. She didn't laugh. She didn't scold him. She didn't walk away. She stayed. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, the fan spinning like a slow ticking clock. Everything in me told me to let it go. I wasn't her son. I wasn't her protector. I wasn't anyone who mattered in this equation. But I couldn't unhear that moment. I couldn't unsee her smile. A few days later, I watched from my window as Clara stepped out of the house after dinner. She paused, checked her phone, then walked swiftly down the sidewalk, toward Ray's place. She didn't take the dog. She didn't carry her purse. She didn't look back. I followed, quietly, keeping my distance. When she reached his porch, Ray opened the door before she could knock, like he'd been waiting. There were no words, just a look, and then the door closed behind them. The porch light went off. That was the moment something inside me broke, not from jealousy, not even from betrayal, but from understanding. I wasn't watching a love story unfold. I was watching a fracture spread across the surface of something I once called home. And suddenly, I wasn't a teenager anymore. I was a witness. The morning after Clara disappeared into Ray's house, she returned just before sunrise. Her steps were slow, careful, as though she feared waking the silence itself. I watched from the window, my breath fogging the glass. She paused at the front door, straightened her hair, and looked around, unaware I was watching. Then she entered. I didn't confront her.
Not yet.
The truth, even when obvious, feels heavier when spoken aloud. And part of me wasn't ready to bear its full weight. At breakfast, Clara behaved as if nothing had happened. She moved quietly around the kitchen, prepared eggs, set the table. Her eyes never met mine. The air between us was hollow, like a room after someone slammed the door and left. "You didn't sleep in your room last night," I said, keeping my tone even. She froze, spatula in hand. Then, slowly, she turned and forced a smile. "I couldn't sleep. Took a walk. Ended up at Ray's. We just talked. Until 4 in the morning?" She looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "It's not what you think."
But it was.
There was no anger in her voice, only fatigue, like someone who'd lost the will to pretend but couldn't yet afford honesty. That, more than anything, made me uncomfortable. She wasn't ashamed. She was just resigned. Over the next few days, Clara's caution began to fade. She no longer waited until the house was quiet. She no longer lied about her walks. Sometimes, she left with a purpose in her step, as if Ray's house had become her real destination, and this one just a stopover. My father remained oblivious. Still working late, still traveling. The few times he called, Clara answered sweetly, dutifully, like the perfect wife. It was a performance she had mastered. Her voice on the phone was soft, affectionate, and entirely false. One evening, after a long silence between us, I asked her, "Do you still love him?" Clara didn't answer right away. She stood by the sink, staring out at the fading sky. "I don't know if I ever did," she finally said. "Not the way he needed me to." That confession, quiet as it was, struck like a shout. It wasn't just betrayal, it was indifference wrapped in honesty. I couldn't tell if I respected her for saying it or resented her more because of it. Then she turned to me, her voice steadier now. "Your father is a good man, but he doesn't see me. He never did. Ray makes me feel visible." The words echoed. Visible. Was that all it took? A kind word from a neighbor? A shared glance under a dying sun? I began to understand something unsettling. Infidelity doesn't always stem from lust. Sometimes, it grows in the quiet voids, neglected affection, misread silences, unmet emotional needs. But that understanding didn't soften the sting. It made it worse. Later that week, I came home to find Ray inside our living room, sitting casually, drinking coffee. His presence was invasive, too familiar, like a stranger slipping into your dreams and rearranging the furniture. Clara was laughing at something he said, her head tilted back, eyes shining. It was a sound I hadn't heard in this house in years. And it didn't belong here. Ray looked at me when I entered. "Hey, Ethan," he said, as if we were friends. I didn't respond. I just walked past him, my pulse in my throat. Behind me, Clara called out, "Don't be rude." I stopped. The irony was staggering. "I think you've redefined the word already," I muttered and went to my room, slamming the door. That night, my world shifted. I heard them again, Clara and Ray, this time in the hallway. Voices low, urgent, guilty. "We need to be careful," Clara whispered. "He knows." Ray's voice followed, smooth as ever. "He's just a kid. What's he going to do?" That sentence turned me from a bystander into something else. I didn't know what yet, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. The next day, my father called to say he'd be home in 2 days. I told Clara. She nodded, too quickly. Her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. That night, she didn't go to Ray's. She stayed home, cooked dinner, cleaned the table, tried to pretend. But I saw the restlessness, the itch beneath her skin. The way her eyes flicked toward the clock every few minutes, counting down time she didn't want to waste. I realized then that this wasn't just a passing mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate crossing of a line she didn't plan to retreat from. And I was the only one who knew. The next morning, I stood by her bedroom door. Knocked once. When she opened it, I met her eyes and said, "When Dad gets home, I'm telling him." Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she sighed. Not angry, not afraid, just tired. "Do what you think is right, Ethan." And with that, she closed the door. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. It felt like the last nail in something already buried. My father arrived home late on a Sunday evening, suitcase in hand, exhaustion etched into his posture. The familiar screech of the front door startled Clara, who had been sitting on the couch, fingers nervously tracing the rim of a cold teacup. She stood the moment she heard his voice. "Clara? Ethan?" "In here," she called, forcing brightness into her tone. He entered the room with a tired smile, placing his bag down before reaching to hug her. She accepted it stiffly, like someone embracing a stranger in public. I watched from the stairs, silent, invisible, just as I'd felt for weeks. "How've things been?" he asked, collapsing into the armchair. Clara glanced at me. Her answer was delayed, carefully measured. Quiet, uneventful. That single word, uneventful, ignited something in me. I felt the truth clawing at my throat, desperate to surface. "Actually," I said, stepping into the room, "there's something we need to talk about." My father looked at me, surprised. Clara went pale. "I didn't want to say anything at first," I began, voice steadier than expected. "But I've seen things. Heard things. Clara hasn't been honest with you." Martin sat up straight. "What do you mean?" Clara spoke quickly, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please." "No," I interrupted. "You told me to do what I thought was right. So I am." I turned to my father eye to eye. "She's been seeing Ray. The neighbor. It's not just friendship. She's been sneaking out at night. I followed her once. She went straight to his house. They spent hours there. And you've seen how he's suddenly in our lives all the time. She didn't even try to hide it." Silence detonated in the room. My father didn't speak. His face didn't shift. But his hands, once relaxed, now gripped the armrests with white knuckles. Clara took a step forward, then stopped, like her body couldn't decide whether to run or confess. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly. "At first, it was just conversations. He listened. He made me feel seen. And I didn't—" Martin's voice cracked, low and stunned. "You weren't there, Martin," she whispered. "You haven't been for a long time. You buried yourself in your work. You stopped looking at me like I mattered." He stood now, slowly, as if the weight of his own life had suddenly become too heavy. "So your answer was to betray me?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I was lonely. I'm not excusing it, but I felt invisible. I expected shouting. Accusations. Maybe something violent in words, if not action. Instead, my father just nodded.
Once. Slowly.
Then he walked toward the window, back turned to both of us. "I gave you everything I could," he said, not bitter, just empty. "And maybe that wasn't enough. But I never thought you'd repay me like this." Clara wiped her face, her voice a whisper. "I didn't plan for it to go this far." "But you let it," he replied. "And now here we are." The room was filled with things unsaid. Years of neglect, regret, silence, and unmet needs, all laid bare. Finally, he turned to me. "Ethan, thank you. I know this wasn't easy." I nodded. It wasn't. It still wasn't. I hadn't done it for revenge. I'd done it to stop pretending everything was fine. The truth wasn't a weapon, it was release. That night, Clara packed a small bag. No shouting followed. No ultimatums. Just the quiet end of something that had cracked long before it collapsed. She stood at the door, hand on the knob, and looked back at us. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely audible. "For all of it." Then she left. The house felt cavernous after that. Every sound echoed louder. My father didn't speak much for the next few days. He moved through the house like a ghost, opening cabinets he didn't need, standing in doorways he didn't walk through. Eventually, we began to speak again. Small things at first: groceries, bills, appointments. But it wasn't long before deeper conversations returned. "She wasn't the right person," he said one night, sitting across from me at the dinner table. "And maybe I wasn't the right man. But I should have seen it." "You couldn't have known," I replied. He shook his head. I stopped paying attention. That's how it starts.
We didn't talk about Ray.
We didn't need to. He was just a symptom, not the sickness. Over time, the house regained its rhythm. A different one. Slower. More aware. And though trust had been broken, something new began to form in its place. A bond built not on illusion, but on the honesty that had nearly torn us apart.